What is the most F-up family secret that you know? Story 1. I have a great aunt who one day just disappeared without a trace. This happened in the 1940s or 50s, around the Portland area, and she was in her mid-20s. She had a good relationship with her family, was a bright and happy person, but one day she simply didn't come home from work. The family was baffled, having no idea where she went or why she would leave, so they assumed she had been kidnapped or had passed away, never to be found again. Flash forward 5 years and her brother is in Chicago for business. After leaving his office one day, he sees her walking down the street. He calls her name, thinking it must be a mistake, but she turns around and sees him. He stops her and, surprised, asks what is happening. She tries to avoid answering his questions, but eventually invites him to her apartment, promising to explain everything once they get there. When they arrive, her brother starts asking questions immediately. She tells him to give her a moment, as she's going to the shop across the street to buy some cigarettes, because this situation is just as overwhelming for her. For some reason, her brother lets her go alone. She never returns and hasn't been seen since. We still have no idea what happened. Story 2. I come from a pretty dysfunctional family, so here are a few secrets, and you can decide which is the most unsettling. My Uncle Jeff once got high and ended up killing his best friend. Since my grandpa was the police chief, Jeff only received minimal punishment. Uncle Jeff also used to engage in harmful behavior towards his daughters for money. His wife eventually divorced him and took the girls with her. A few years later, both daughters ended up pregnant, with their stepfather involved, who ironically was a preacher. My grandpa passed away from a serious illness, but the family told everyone it was cancer to protect his reputation. I still don't know how he contracted it, and everyone avoids the topic. The same grandpa used to spread false rumors about my mom having affairs, which caused tension in her marriage. He continued doing this even after my mom suffered due to the resulting conflict. My grandma didn't want my uncle to marry a particular woman, so she reportedly hired some people to threaten and intimidate the woman, hoping she'd stay away. My sister ran away from home once and faced a traumatic event. Unfortunately, no one took action to help her, and instead, she was blamed for being rebellious. My family even used to joke about it, though now the subject is never discussed. Story 3. Once, our small 3-family house in East Boston was robbed. The main item stolen was my grandmother's prized jewelry from Italy. I was young, probably under 10 years old, watching my Italian grandfather talk to the police. He politely declined their offers of help and then made a few phone calls once they left. Shortly afterward, the phone rang and my grandfather answered, speaking in Italian, words I couldn't understand. He then kissed my grandmother and headed out the door. I remember one phrase he said before hanging up, a heavily accented term I mimicked playfully, unaware of the serious situation. It sounded like blow calipore. I kept repeating it until I realized it was a new phrase I had never heard before. So I asked my grandmother what it meant, and she told me, lock the door. Years later, my mother explained the story's context. A friend of my grandfather's had called to inform him that 2 men were trying to sell my grandmother's jewelry at a local Italian cafe. The last thing my grandfather said to those men on the phone was a heavily accented version of bloccare la porta, meaning lock the door. I don't know what happened afterward, but my grandfather returned with all the missing jewelry about 15 minutes later. Story 4. My uncle is my adoptive father, and my aunt is my adoptive mother. My biological father returned from Vietnam in 1969, and he was deeply affected by the experience. I'm not sure where he was or what he witnessed, but it wasn't easy for a young man from northern Minnesota. After returning, he struggled with substance abuse, including heroin and alcohol. He met my mother, and amidst a whirlwind of addiction, they got married. Shortly after, my mother became pregnant. From what I understand, my mother wasn't a heavy drug user until she met my father. Tragically, their relationship became very volatile. When I was around 10 months old, they had an argument in the garage, during which my father threw me to the floor, causing severe injuries. My mother fought back, striking him with an object. My father then retrieved a weapon, injuring both my mother and himself. I nearly lost my life that day and spent most of the following year in the hospital. Doctors feared long-term effects, but I recovered better than expected. Though I still experience occasional headaches from the incident, I was fortunate to be adopted by my uncle and aunt, whom I consider my true parents. They provided me with a loving home. Story 5. When I was 21, I'm almost 24 now, my oldest sister confided in me that she was assaulted by a stranger when she was 17. I was shocked because no one in my large family had ever mentioned it before. My sister is 17 years older than me, and we resemble each other closely. I once asked my mom specific questions about my birth for a class project, but she couldn't recall details like who was in the room or what time I was born. My parents are also very religious and strongly oppose abortion. Over time, I began to suspect that I might actually be my sister's daughter, the result of that tragic event, and that my grandparents have been raising me as their own child all these years. It seems like something they might have done, considering the circumstances. However, I never asked my sister directly, partly because it doesn't quite make sense that she would share such a personal story without mentioning this possibility. I also don't want to risk hurting her feelings or making a sensitive situation about me. It's more of a strange theory than a confirmed truth. Story 6. I guess my childhood is the family secret. Everyone knows my grandma is my mom, but I was actually adopted. My biological mother married a man who hurt me throughout my early childhood until I was about 5 or 6. I told a friend who told her parents, who then informed the school. Instead of confronting her husband, whom she had 2 other kids with, my biological mother told the police I was lying, and I was sent to foster care, allowing my stepdad to avoid charges. She even placed a restraining order on me until I turned 18. My very loving grandmother adopted me, and our family moved across the state. It was difficult in school. I remember getting in trouble once, and when the staff wanted to call my parent, I asked them to call my grandma. But grandma wasn't listed on the file. Only mom was. It was uncomfortable being questioned by the vice principal about why I didn't always call my grandma mom. It's just something you don't usually share with others, you know? Sorry if I'm rambling. This is a throwaway account, just in case anyone checks my main account's post history. Story 7. The rumor in my family is that my great-grandma, Gigi, was a black widow. She had 4 husbands, and all 4 died under mysterious circumstances. One of her husbands was stabbed by Gigi's brother, with the story being that Gigi was attacked by him, and her brother intervened in self-defense. No charges were ever brought against them. My grandma, Gigi's daughter, stopped speaking to her when she was 18 in 1950, and Gigi passed away in 2014 at the age of 96. That's a long time to not speak to your own mother, so something serious must have happened. The rumor is that my grandma believed her father was killed by Gigi and that she got away with it. However, my grandma refuses to discuss it, even after Gigi's death. I became quite close to Gigi during the last decade of her life, and she seemed like the sweetest, most typical grandmother you could imagine most of the time. But occasionally, when something made her angry, she would get this unsettling look on her face that made me wonder if the rumors were true. Story 8. I recently lost a cousin who struggled with homelessness, addiction, and alcoholism. As he was nearing the end of his life, he expressed a desire to find out what happened to his father. His dad had been abusive, causing severe harm when my cousin was just 2 years old, prompting my aunt to leave him. They had 4 children together, but none had heard anything about their dad for 40 years. The 3 surviving children have no interest in knowing about him or his fate. I did some online searching and found out their father passed away about 10 years ago. He had another family that my cousins know nothing about. This second family is well off, while my cousins live in poverty. One of his daughters from the second family lives in our community, and it seems from her social media posts that she attends the same church as one of my surviving cousins. It's possible they know each other, though they'd have no idea about their shared connection. I've decided not to tell them unless I see that their children might end up dating each other. Story 9. This isn't really a confirmed family secret, but there's a suspicion that my grandpa may have been involved in something serious. He's a difficult person with a quick temper, and was known to be abusive toward his wives and children. My mom still bears scars from his actions decades later. At one point, my grandpa had conflicts with someone, possibly a local cop or another individual. And weeks later, this person was found dead near train tracks. Years later, my grandpa told my mom something along the lines of, "If you ever have problems with someone, I know how to handle it." He also displayed signs of troubling behavior, including cruelty toward animals. Story 10. My grandpa has a son from another woman who is the same age as my uncle. The woman named her son after my grandpa as well, so technically I have 2 Uncle Roberts. My mom's side of the family doesn't talk about him. I only found out because my mom let it slip when I was in high school, mentioning that he had just been released from jail and was trying to contact my grandpa. I don't think many of my cousins know about this, except maybe my uncle's children. My grandfather and uncle have a very rocky relationship, and I can imagine my uncle might have told his kids about this to turn them against my grandpa. Despite the family history, all of us cousins love our grandpa very much. My grandparents have been married for 60 years. I'm not sure how my grandma dealt with everything back then, but she did, and I think that's incredible. Story 11. My mom always claimed she was arrested because of my dad. He smoked a lot of marijuana and apparently stored some in her car, which got her into trouble. My brother and I lived with my dad's adoptive parents for 5 years while our biological parents were in jail. I never really questioned who my real parents were, since I was with my grandparents from infancy until I was about 5, and I assumed they were my parents. Recently, they returned a bunch of my childhood belongings, including some court documents. It turns out we were removed from my mom's custody because of child neglect. The house was described as borderline unsanitary. There was marijuana in the fridge, but not much food, and both my brother and I had numerous bruises. I had a broken rib, and my brother needed treatment for a fractured skull. Despite having opportunities to visit us in a neutral location, my mom didn't show up. When she was finally granted a few days with us under supervision, she would just drive around aimlessly for hours. For reasons I can't understand, we were eventually returned to her custody. She had a new boyfriend who also mistreated us. My brother has muscular dystrophy, and she treated him like a child, even though he was growing up. He believes everything she says and resents our grandparents for trying to ensure he got proper care, like speech therapy and close monitoring at school. He thinks they hated him because our mom told him so. My mom will never admit the truth to anyone. She always portrays herself as the victim, the brave single mom doing her best. It's classic narcissistic behavior. Story 12. My mother and I are convinced that my grandfather may have fathered a child with his girlfriend while stationed in Europe during World War II. He rarely spoke about his time in the war, but we knew he had a serious relationship while he was there. They were apparently very much in love, and he was supposed to bring her to the US when he returned. But he never did. As disappointing as that is, we didn't think much of it, assuming it was a relatively common occurrence back then. After he passed away, we sorted through his belongings and found a photo of a woman. According to his note on the back, she was his girlfriend. In the picture, she's smiling and pointing at what looks like a noticeable pregnancy bump. We're not 100% sure, but we're fairly certain she was pregnant when the photo was taken. It makes me wonder why my grandfather never sent for her, and if I have unknown cousins somewhere in Europe right now. Story 13. When I was a kid, we had to spread salt all over our floors, or we'd wake up each morning to find them covered in slugs. Not just a few slugs, but enough to make it look like we had a slimy black carpet. It was like a scene from a horror movie. At first, I was disgusted, but I later learned they were actually useful. You could squeeze them for relief from dry eyes or rub their secretions on cuts or scrapes to speed up healing. Their mucus contains some kind of chemical that helps, though it has a weird taste. If someone in the family had diaper rash, we'd even place a few slugs in the diaper, and it seemed to work wonders. We thought the slugs were entering the house through the bathtub faucet, but it turns out my eccentric grandma was stealing them from our neighbor's slug farm. In 1997, she accidentally caused a slug shortage in North Houston because of this. Story 14. I know a messed up secret about my friend's family. His mother was involved in the adult film industry in the 70s and 80s, but later left that life and married his father. When the internet became more accessible in the mid-90s, my friend, like many teenagers, started exploring it. Before you jump to conclusions, this story goes in a different direction. He didn't just stumble across pictures of his mom unknowingly. Instead, he admitted to me that he intentionally searched for them, out of curiosity, after hearing rumors from his dad. Once he found the images, he realized he was attracted to them and acted on those feelings. I was shocked when he told me this, and it changed how I viewed him for a while. However, he eventually showed me one of her old films, grainy and definitely from another era, which from a teenage perspective was more exposure than we were used to back then. Surprisingly, I could understand why he felt that way, even if it was bizarre. Story 15. My grandfather cheated on my grandmother with another woman around the time I was born, and they had a child together. This has been a family secret for decades. I'm 29 now. Only my grandmother, my oldest uncle, and I know about it. I found out when I was living with my grandparents for a few years to help them out. One day, my grandfather asked for help setting up online banking. He wanted to set up automatic payments, which I assumed were for bills. As I was assisting him, he mentioned sending payments to Julia. I thought he meant a company, but when I asked what the payments were for, he replied, "To get back at your nana." I was shocked. and we ended up talking about it for 2 hours. He explained that my grandmother had cheated on him, so he sought revenge by having an affair. I discovered I have a half-uncle who is my age. I've tried to get more information from my grandfather and uncle, but they won't share anything further. I think it would be interesting to meet an uncle my age. Story 16. My aunt had a baby as a teenager. My uncle helped her deliver it at home. He left the room briefly to get something to cut the umbilical cord and tie it off, but he panicked when he heard the baby stop crying. He rushed back and found the baby no longer breathing. The baby seemed healthy at first, so he was shocked and angrily asked my aunt, "What happened?" She nonchalantly said, "The baby just stopped breathing." Later, she admitted to having smothered it. My aunt was only about 15 at the time, while my mother was around 8 or 9 years old and very confused by what happened. It wasn't until later that she pieced the story together while talking to my uncle. According to my mother, my grandfather was furious and nearly beat my aunt, then went outside and buried the child in the backyard. My grandfather was a World War II veteran who had seen a lot, but my mom said he cried the entire time he dug the grave. Apparently, my aunt had other pregnancies during her teenage years, with one baby being stillborn and another one not surviving for other reasons. My aunt has since passed away, and she was widely considered to be a cruel person. Ironically, she was also a Methodist preacher. Story 17. Growing up, there was this woman who would occasionally show up at family gatherings. She was considered the problem child of an old family friend who had passed away. She often came around asking for money or a place to stay. The family said she had fallen into a bad lifestyle involving drugs and other problems, so most of the family shunned her. As I got older, I began to talk to her more, thinking I could relate to her in some way. That's when I found out she was actually my sister. It turned out my extremely religious mother had her when she was a teenager, and my grandparents did everything they could to keep the situation a secret from the community. This revelation was one of the many reasons I eventually left my hometown and developed a strong dislike for religious communities that prioritize reputation over family. Story 18. My parents recently shared some details about what my grandfather did to my grandmother in the late 1930s. I knew my mother had an older sister who was stillborn, but I never understood why that happened. Apparently, my grandfather didn't want the baby, so when my grandmother went into labor, instead of bringing the doctor as he had promised, he disappeared, leaving her to give birth alone at home, miles from any help. This was in an era when home births were common and phones were not available in rural areas. He returned more than 24 hours later with a doctor, but by then it was too late. The baby had passed away, and my grandmother was in critical condition. Despite this, they stayed together, though I can't imagine why. When my mother was born, my grandmother made sure she was closer to help, walking herself to the doctor's office to avoid a similar situation. There's also a mysterious secret that my grandfather shared with my father on his deathbed about something he did during World War II. My father refuses to tell anyone about it, saying, "You wouldn't be able to handle it." Considering my father has openly discussed his own experiences during the Vietnam War, this secret must be truly disturbing. Story 19. My cousin was struggling with heroin addiction while living at her parents' house. Once they discovered her addiction, they sent her to a treatment center without doing much research. After dropping her off, the treatment group took her to a big city and started trying to convert her to a new belief system. They had her hold an electrode in each hand and asked her to confess her wrongdoings. Then, they demanded $500 for some unspecified reason. My cousin eventually called her parents, angry that they had unintentionally sent her to this group. Her parents were shocked as they had no idea. They quickly went to pick her up and bring her home. Story 20. I was taking care of my grandfather's house after his failed attempt to harm himself. When he came back from the hospital, I stayed with him for a few days. Before leaving to check on my own home, I went to give him a hug. Suddenly, he grabbed me inappropriately, which was shocking and upsetting. I immediately told him, "You can't do that." And he responded by saying we weren't biologically related, which was disturbing. This man had been my grandfather all my life, so it hurt me deeply. I told my father about what happened, but he insisted that my grandfather was not mentally well and was likely delusional. I tried to let it go and continued helping my grandfather with errands, groceries, and medication refills. About a week later, while washing dishes, he touched me inappropriately again. This time, I hit him with the spatula I was holding, causing him to fall. I helped him to his recliner and left shortly afterward. Neither of us mentioned the incident to anyone else, and I haven't returned since. Story 21. When I was very young, my grandfather on my mother's side was said to be battling leukemia. I remember my mother flying to Iowa a few times to visit him. Eventually, he passed away, and I assumed it was due to leukemia. Fast forward about 18 years, and my brother suddenly asks, "How do you think Grandpa died?" I replied, "Leukemia," but he said, "That's what I thought too. But according to our older brother, he took his own life." Apparently, my mother didn't want us to know the truth. According to my older brother, our grandfather was very depressed and ended his life with a gun. It was because of his depression that my mom initially flew to Iowa, out of concern for his mental state. I don't have the courage to ask my mom directly, as I don't want to make her relive that painful memory. Whether it's true or not, I fear bringing up such a sensitive topic and causing her more pain. I've tried searching Iowa death records, as I know the county he lived in, but I haven't found anything conclusive. I'd like to know the truth, but I doubt I'll ever be able to ask my mom about it. Story 22. There's a strange joke that my uncles only tell when they've had a bit too much to drink. It involves a sound that's part of the joke, a long, raspy noise, like someone clearing their throat. After every family event, when the day's activities are over, the uncles gather outside, out of sight. While the aunts wash dishes and the cousins play, the uncles sit under the trees, leaning back in their chairs, drinking and laughing. Then one uncle makes the sound, "Show rook." Even though it's dark, you can imagine him making a hand gesture, moving sideways in front of his neck. The aunts smile and shake their heads at the noise. Men. The cousins mimic the sound, running around and laughing. The uncles lean down, teaching the younger ones to make the sound and gesture. It becomes a sort of family tradition, passed from one generation to the next. When asked about its meaning, the uncles always say they'll tell us when you're older. It's a story they promise to share later, keeping it mysterious and secret. On the summer I turned 18, I finally heard the full story. My uncle said it was from the war when they were all in the same regiment. They were captured and forced to work in a labor camp. Every day, they feared for their lives under the watchful eyes of a ruthless officer. The officer had a brutal routine. If he found a woman he desired, he'd force her into a humiliating situation before taking her life. The sound, "Show rook," was the noise made when the officer would commit the horrific act. But one day, as he was attempting this, he accidentally harmed himself in the process, ending his own life. The uncles always viewed that moment as the symbol of unexpected survival, a terrible act that somehow led to their escape from a grim fate. Now that sound is the family's secret code for hope. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something unexpected might save you. Story 23. When I was 17, my father broke down and shared a difficult truth with me. He had another child, born 16 months before me, with a woman who wasn't my mother. This happened during a brief separation between my parents, and everyone in the family knew, except for me. My half-brother was raised entirely by his mother, and my father didn't meet him until he was 13 years old, all while living a seemingly normal life with my mom and me. Even my mom was aware of his existence. My parents had come to an agreement. As long as my dad had no involvement with his other child, they could make their marriage work. Whenever we visited my grandparents, they would hide photos of my half-brother to keep me from finding out. It was a family-wide secret. I've always felt some guilt, knowing I was the child my father chose to raise. But thankfully, my half-brother and I have formed a close relationship, and my father has been making an effort to build a bond with him over the past few years. Story 24. I have a great uncle who is, frankly, a terrible person. He's a preacher for some church, but I'm not even sure which denomination it belongs to, and I doubt he follows any real religious doctrine. He's the biggest hypocrite I know. He acts self-righteous and condemns other religions. He won't welcome anyone into his church unless they are donating money. Most of my family is Roman Catholic, and he once told one of my aunts that she, along with the rest of us who follow such a heathen religion, is doomed. He even said he'd be up in the castle, higher up in heaven than everyone else. Regardless of someone's beliefs, that's just wrong. He also insulted my grandpa, his brother-in-law, for asking him to pray before undergoing surgery for an aneurysm. You'd think a preacher would offer comfort, but apparently not. But that's not even the worst of it. My great-uncle used to sell drugs, serious drugs, and he made his nieces and nephews deliver them. We're talking about things like crack and heroin. To make it even worse, he molested at least 2 of my aunts when they were young. They only came forward about it recently because they felt guilty for so long. His son also assaulted one of my aunts. Despite all of this, my family continued to interact with him for years to avoid causing a rift. Much of this information, like the abuse, only came out recently. However, most of the family knew about the drug dealing, even if they didn't know he was involving the kids. The real breaking point was when he started bad-mouthing my grandparents about their religion. That's when my grandparents learned about everything else, and they finally cut ties with him. It was about time. He always gave me the creeps as a kid. Story 25. About 3 years ago, my mother tried to harm my daughter by depriving her of water. We were at a family picnic, and my mother gave my son food and water when he asked. But my nonverbal 2-year-old daughter got nothing. It took us a while to realize what was happening. It was actually my 5-year-old son who pointed it out. I couldn't imagine telling a toddler, "No, you can't have water." When I confronted my mother, she told my wife and me that my daughter didn't deserve it, because she wasn't the firstborn. I was furious and ready to physically confront her, but my dad was there and defended her verbally. By the time we intervened, my daughter was so dehydrated that we had to force fluids into her. She ended up needing a hospital visit and an IV, which was traumatic for a 2-year-old. We've only spoken to my parents twice since at my grandparents' funerals, and they haven't seen either of my children since that incident. Once my mother tried to visit our home, but I told her that if she ever tried to contact my kids again, I'd call the police and defend my family if necessary. It may sound dramatic, but I mean it. My kids will decide how they feel about their grandparents when they're old enough, but until then, it's my responsibility to protect them. Story 26. My mother's biological father married my grandmother while he was stationed in Chicago. When they found out she was pregnant, he left and returned home. My grandmother managed to figure out where he lived from the limited information he had given her, so she took a train to confront him. This happened in the 1940s. When she arrived, his sisters met her, explained that he was already married with children, and handed her about $800, a significant amount at the time, suggesting she take care of it, get an abortion. My grandmother was devastated. Instead, she decided to use the money to return to Chicago and start a new life for herself and my mother. So, the big secret in our family is simply that my mother exists. A few years ago, I had a cancer scare and signed up for a genetic testing website. Someone reached out, claiming to be my third cousin, but didn't know how we were related. After comparing names, we realized we were connected through my mom's biological father. We figured out his identity about 5 years ago. He had since passed away, but was a prominent figure in his state. He served as the state's attorney general for over 20 years and was well known in society. If it had come out that he had an illegitimate child, it probably would have ruined his career. Story 27. My aunt passed away a little over a year ago. My dad's side of the family is large, as he has or had 7 siblings, so there were many cousins and extended relatives at the funeral. During the event, I was having a relatively serious conversation with one of my cousins when a man, likely in his 50s, approached me and started talking. He gave off a very creepy vibe, so I responded briefly, hoping to get away from him as quickly as possible. I noticed that my grandma was completely ignoring him. She outright pretended he wasn't there whenever he tried to engage with her. A few days later, I overheard my dad talking to the cousin I had been speaking to at the funeral, and I managed to catch some of their conversation. It turns out that this man is actually the child of my grandmother and my deceased aunt's husband. My grandma had an affair with him while my grandpa was in jail. However, she refuses to acknowledge that it ever happened, which is why she gave the child up for adoption and refuses to even look at him now. Story 28. One of the most tragic events in my family's history happened when my mother was young. She was visiting her 3 cousins at her aunt's house, who was dying of cancer. Her cousins invited her to stay the night, but fortunately, my grandma decided against it, and they went home after dinner. I don't know if it was the stress of his wife's illness, but my mother's uncle decided that the family needed to join her in heaven. He shot his 2 younger children while they slept. My mother's oldest cousin managed to escape through a window after hearing the gunshots. She ran to a neighbor's house, and they called the police. When the police arrived, my mother's uncle attempted to take his own life, but the gun jammed. He was arrested and sent to a psychiatric facility after the incident. I don't know what happened to him afterward. Story 29. It turns out that my father is not my biological father. I always knew my mother was previously married and divorced. but I never asked for details. She often told me that if I ever wanted to know the full story, all I had to do was ask. But I wasn't interested in the drama. One evening, while visiting my grandmother, uncle, and aunt, my grandmother accidentally let it slip that she couldn't stand my biological father. She mentioned his full name, which had the same last name as my current father's. At first, I thought she was confused since she's 90 years old. I asked her to repeat it, and she said the same name again. Everyone else seemed puzzled, except for my aunt, whose jaw dropped. She then revealed that my biological father is actually my stepfather's brother. So my mom married two brothers. It didn't change my perception of anyone, but it was definitely a shocking revelation. Story 30. My aunt has always stood out in our family. She has a darker complexion, jet black hair, and is very thin. Her siblings used to joke that she was adopted or found, making cruel comments like kids often do. We were always told that she resembled a distant relative. When she was around 40, my grandfather reconnected with the family after spending a few years living in Florida. That's when the truth came out. My grandparents were once swingers, and my aunt was the result of my grandmother's affair with another man. This revelation also explained why my grandparents eventually separated. On top of that, my grandfather had an affair with his brother's wife, which led to a major fallout. It's the reason my grandfather and his brother don't speak, and why I've never met my great-uncle. So the big family secret is that my grandfather was quite unfaithful and may have pressured my grandmother into the swinging lifestyle. Story 31. My daughter was conceived while I was asleep. I had just started a new job in the climate change department of the local government. It was a great opportunity, but my partner wasn't happy about it and began making life difficult for me. He wasn't employed, so he was supposed to handle taking our son to school, but he often didn't bother. He also refused to do any cleaning around the house. Our relationship had deteriorated to the point where we hadn't been intimate for months. Resentment isn't exactly a turn-on. One day, after dropping off my son at school, I was running late. I needed to withdraw money and get a taxi. At the bank, I realized something else was off. My period was 3 weeks late. I stopped by a pharmacy to buy a pregnancy test, fully expecting it to be negative because, well, you need to have sex to get pregnant. To my shock, both tests came back positive. I sat there for an hour, stunned. My partner knocked on the bathroom door, and I asked him how I could possibly be pregnant. He admitted to having sex with me while I was sleeping and said that he had a feeling I would get pregnant from that encounter. I didn't go to work that day. The next day, I explained the situation to my boss, who was understanding. The pregnancy was tough, and I received no support, as I was single by then for obvious reasons. I had to leave my job due to low blood pressure, leg swelling, and dizziness. Unfortunately, I hadn't been employed long enough to qualify for maternity leave. Despite everything, I tried to put my feelings aside and allowed my ex to have contact with our daughter. She stayed with him and his mother 3 days a week. I assumed she would be safe since his two sisters also lived there. But I was wrong, and I will never forgive myself for that misjudgment. When my daughter was 3 months old, he harmed her, though he didn't confess to me until a few months ago. He no longer sees her, and his family cut off contact with him as well. As far as I know, he is homeless now. My daughter will never know the details of how she came into this world or why her father isn't in her life. Story 32. My maternal grandmother had a habit of stealing whatever she could fit in her purse. This is why she rarely came to our house. My mom would always confiscate her bag and coat when she did. It's also why either my mom or dad would go back into restaurants with her while the rest of us waited in the car. It was later explained that this behavior was likely a result of living through the Great Depression. My mom's brother once partially burned down their home to avoid being drafted for the Vietnam War. He succeeded, but later, he was committed to a specialized care facility for schizophrenia, perhaps a precursor or consequence of his actions. There's also a strong suspicion that my mom and my aunt suffered from schizophrenia, though it's impossible to confirm now. My mom was married twice before she met my father. She was forced to divorce her first husband after they were arrested for smuggling drugs across the border. He went to jail, and she received probation with orders to cut all contact with him. She left her second husband because he was abusive and only kept her around to care for his children. After my mom passed away, we discovered that she had maintained contact with all the children from her second marriage. She had saved their high school and college graduation photos, and one of her stepsons had even joined the military. They had grandchildren who considered her a grandmother, and we found some photos among her belongings. We only learned about this months after her funeral, and we had no way to contact them. as my mom wasn't tech-savvy and barely used her phone. My mother had also hidden our baby pictures because my siblings and I chose to live with our dad after the divorce. She claimed someone had stolen them during a break-in, but we later found them buried in her closet. Recently, I found out that my aunt is doing something similar, keeping childhood photos of herself, my mom, and my uncle, along with other family history. I'm not sure if these stories count as secrets, but it felt good to share them. Story 33. Growing up, I was never allowed to go into our basement, where my grandpa spent most of his time. I was never given a clear reason, just that I wasn't supposed to go down there. I assumed that was normal. Didn't everyone have a basement that was off limits? As I got older, I noticed people coming and going from the basement late at night, usually older men with heavy accents. One night, I was woken up by loud cheering and shouting coming from the basement. While this was somewhat normal, it was much louder than usual. I got up to investigate and saw at least a dozen men, all over 60, smelling of whiskey and cigars, carrying my grandpa out of the basement cheering. I had never seen him look so happy. The next morning, I asked my parents about it over breakfast. They flatly denied hearing anything. When I insisted that I was certain of what I saw, they changed their story, saying, "Grandpa had some friends from the bowling club over last night." This continued for a few more years, until my grandpa fell ill due to asbestos exposure and eventually passed away after spending his final months in a care home. Later on, I began hearing the basement door quietly opening and closing at night. One night, I caught my dad coming out of the basement at 4 a.m. I figured he missed Grandpa and was reminiscing down there. One day when I was 14 and homesick from school, I realized I could finally see what was in the basement, and no one could stop me. The first thing I noticed were 3 very old blackboards with tables written in chalk. The tables were divided into columns and rows, listing names of men and their timed scores. I recognized some of the names as family members and neighbors. The room was dusty and dark, but had a bar with stools and an old desk at the end, complete with a computer. That evening, I confronted my father, and he took me down there, poured himself a drink, and explained everything. Years earlier, Grandpa had watched a news segment on violent video games and became fascinated. He bought a computer and the popular game Duke Nukem, then shared it with his friends, who became just as hooked. They started competing speed-running levels for the fastest times and even placing bets. The weekly prizes were usually alcohol, and this secret competition continued for years without anyone else in the family knowing. When the rest of the family eventually found out, everyone found it hilarious. Judging by the old records we found, a lot of people had been involved in this secret competition over the years, with some bets reaching as high as $1,000. And some of the times were quite impressive. It's not as shocking as some other stories, but it's definitely the most bizarre family secret I know. To this day, my dad and I still play a few levels together over a glass of scotch whenever I visit. Story 34. My mother's first child was given up for adoption because the father left before the baby was born. Later, she had 2 daughters with her first husband, who was a gambling addict. Tragically, he abused the girls for several years. Eventually, my mother either left him or he left her. I'm not sure which. She then met my father and had me and my brother. My father was an alcoholic who left shortly after my younger brother was born. His excuse was that my mom was boring. My mother's explanation was that she had gone to check on him in the bathroom at a bar, only to find him passed out in the urinal. Neither my sister's father nor mine ever paid child support, which probably explains why my mom felt we needed a man in the house. She used a matchmaking service and met the man who would become my stepfather. My stepfather was illiterate and unemployed. Although we were never told exactly what was wrong with him, we knew he was off and received injections from a nurse every 2 weeks. He smoked 100 cigarettes a day. I vividly remember watching in horror as he strangled my sister to the point where I thought she was dead. She fell limp, not moving for what felt like forever, before finally gasping for air, blood spilling onto the floor. I wanted my mom to call the police, but she insisted on keeping him around for childcare while she worked long hours cleaning houses. She made him promise never to do it again. He later suffered a breakdown and received electroshock therapy, but he returned home and the fighting resumed. When I turned 18, my mom finally had enough and disappeared. Since we lived in government housing and my sisters had already moved out, that left only my stepfather, my brother, and me. We were evicted shortly after, as there weren't enough occupants for a 3-bedroom house. Before we moved out, I found one of my stepfather's medical records, which confirmed he had schizophrenia. This explained a lot. My grandfather, the only decent father figure I had, ended up in the hospital just before we had to move. I intended to visit him, but my stepfather convinced me it was nothing serious. I decided to work my shift that night instead. My grandfather passed away that same night, and my stepfather laughed as he told me. My eldest sister had a child whose father left while she was pregnant. She had become very religious and forgave her own father for his past abuse. When he needed a place to stay, she let him live with her in the house she had inherited from our grandfather. Although I don't believe he harmed her son, he left his lighter on the table, which my nephew used to start a fire that burned down the house. My other sister, the one who was strangled, had 4 children, but tragically lost one when she accidentally suffocated the baby by rolling onto it in her sleep. She initially claimed it was SIDS, but later admitted the truth. She struggled with addiction, and we eventually had to remove her other children from her care. Meanwhile, all those years my mom was cleaning houses. She was paid under the table while also collecting disability benefits, claiming her wrist never healed after an old injury. Story 35. My brother and I have different fathers, but the same mother. When we were very young, my brother's dad shot and killed my father and buried him in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He was later sent to prison, San Quentin. Over the years, my mother was vague about the details, but inconsistencies started to emerge. Something drove me to dig into the case when I became an adult. I reviewed the old, high-profile murder case files from the Bay Area in 1976. The case was connected to heavy drug use and involvement with the Hells Angels. I discovered that my mother had testified against my brother's father to avoid prison time for her own involvement in the incident. I'll never know the full extent of her involvement, as the plea deal allowed her to walk away with a completely redacted testimony. I've never confronted my mother about this, mostly because she wasn't a bad parent in the years that followed. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with what little I do know and to forgive her privately. Story 36. My aunt on my father's side endured a very abusive marriage while living in the UK during the 80s and 90s, a time when there was minimal support for Asian victims of violence. Her husband's abuse was severe, including incidents where he beat her to the point of kidney failure and burned his son for misbehavior. He would even beat her at her workplace over trivial matters, like a teacup's handle being on the wrong side, or simply for talking to other men. I once witnessed him threatening my aunt, and when I spoke up, he punched me in the stomach. When my mother learned that I had tried to protect my aunt and cousins, she took action. My mother, who is half Scottish and half mixed-race Indian, with Tamil and East Asian ancestry, went to their house, rescued my aunt and cousins, and drove them to safety in Manchester. I missed a few days of school due to injuries from the assault. We later learned that my father's side of the family had known about the abuse, but did nothing, fearing the stigma of divorce in Indian culture. Even after my mother's intervention, some family members continued to make excuses for him. My mother called the police, but nothing came of it. The situation escalated to the point where my parents sent me to boarding school to protect me from potential retaliation. Eventually, my aunt's husband left the UK for the USA. Sadly, the impact on my cousins was profound. While the older son became a lawyer, the younger one, spoiled by his father's attempts to buy affection, struggled to find direction in life. This experience taught me a lot about how abuse can manipulate good people into tolerating terrible behavior and how much has changed over the years in terms of awareness and support. Story 37. My mom grew up in a large family in a rough area of the San Francisco Bay Area. The family had a notorious reputation within a 100-mile radius, known for criminal activity like carjackings and gang violence. When my mom was around 3, she recalls her older brothers who were in their 20s, sneaking downstairs and assaulting her. This continued for years until she was 8, when she confided in her 5-year-old brother. Another brother who wasn't involved overheard and informed my grandma. One of the perpetrators went to prison, and another later took his own life. What's especially heartbreaking is that my mom often closed her eyes during the attacks, so she couldn't always identify who was harming her. She remembers only 2 of the brothers specifically. When one of them committed suicide, my grandmother blamed my mom, saying, "He would still be alive if you hadn't opened your legs." Despite this horrific past, my mom is one of the strongest women I know. She hasn't shared her story with many people, but I believe she should write a book about her experiences, as she is one of the kindest and most loving people I've ever met. She managed to graduate from college, raise a family, and keep her children out of trouble, all while maintaining compassion and love for others. It's remarkable how she turned her life around. Story 38. A friend's parents owned a funeral home and had 2 sons. One son was fathered by an employee, making the boys half-brothers, but the son born to the owners never knew this. The owner's son had serious behavioral issues. As a child, he set fire to the funeral home, killing his parents and believing he had also killed his half-brother. However, the employee saved his badly burned son from the fire and hid him in a mental institution for many years. Over the next 20 years, the arsonist continued the family business as an undertaker, mentored by the same employee who had fathered his half-brother. He had no idea of the true relationship between them. The truth came out on national television when the half-brother, now wearing a mask to cover his scars, was revealed to be alive. This discovery sparked a bitter feud between the two brothers over the family business. Story 39. There have been some disturbing stories that recently surfaced about the Kennedys. One of the most shocking involves an incident during the birth of one of their daughters. While Mrs. Kennedy was in labor, she was reportedly not allowed to push until the obstetrician arrived, as he needed to be present to receive payment. The nurse was instructed to hold the baby's head in place until the doctor arrived, which took several hours. As a result, the baby suffered from severe oxygen deprivation, leading to developmental delays. The family allegedly concealed this incident to avoid public embarrassment. As the daughter matured, the family became concerned about the possibility of her becoming pregnant. Mr. Kennedy proposed an extreme solution, a lobotomy to remove her sexual impulses. Without informing the rest of the family, he approved the procedure. At the time, doctors were still uncertain about the specifics of lobotomies, so the surgeon performed several incisions in her brain, ultimately causing her to lose the ability to speak. The daughter was then sent to an institution, with the family telling others that she had moved to the Midwest to teach and desired privacy. Story 40. My family is quite open about many things. They come from poverty, and reflecting on the past is seen as a way to avoid repeating mistakes. For example, my grandfather often tells the story of a Civil War-era ancestor who killed a man over a pair of boots, forcing him to flee to the plains. This same ancestor once bit off a prostitute's nipple. Ultimately, he went insane and during a harsh Minnesota winter, pointed a rifle at his daughter-in-law. As a result, he was left on the front porch to freeze to death. Stories like these are common in my family, mainly because the people involved have long since passed away. However, it's the stories about living family members that bother me. For instance, I grew up with my grandmother trying to protect me from my alcoholic father. Her efforts were so intense that they sometimes defied logic. She did the same for other family members, driven by a strong need to protect and save everyone. I only recently discovered the reason behind her behavior. Her own father was an alcoholic who abused her. Other things are less intense but still unsettling in ways most people wouldn't understand. For example, during family reunions, certain items are left at home to prevent theft. This is because there are several high-functioning drug addicts in the family, and certain items could be stolen and pawned off. How do you even explain that to people? Given the poverty from which my family comes, there are also quite a few felons among us. Most have served their time and now function well in society. I feel obligated to keep this a secret, which is troubling in its own way. People often treat felons as if they are less than human, and speaking up about it could lead to my ostracization. Story 41. My aunt was in a long-term relationship for most of my life, likely over 10 years. A few years ago, she and her fiancé broke off their engagement, and my aunt decided to try online dating. She met a man online, and they developed a long-distance relationship. While my aunt had a webcam, the man did not. He would message her while she was on camera, watching her fall asleep. Eventually, she convinced him to talk on the phone, but she was shocked when the voice on the other end was a woman. The woman claimed that her deceased brother's soul was living inside her body and that he was the person my aunt had fallen in love with. Despite this bizarre explanation, my aunt drove from Vermont to Arizona to bring the woman back to live with her and her 3 children. Once the woman moved in, her behavior became increasingly strange. She left bundles of sage outside my cousin's doors to ward off bad spirits, convinced my aunt to sell most of her possessions, and even claimed that spirits had pushed her down the stairs, resulting in a broken arm. At some point, my aunt and the woman entered a civil union. A few months later, the woman attempted to kidnap my aunt's youngest son and take him back to a cult in Arizona. Fortunately, she was caught, and my aunt got her son back. However, the woman had already drained both my aunt's and my grandparents' bank accounts. My aunt eventually had the civil union annulled and has not heard from the woman since. Story 42. In her prime, my grandmother was part of the elite in Chinese society. hosting lavish parties attended by high-ranking nobility and political figures. It was no secret that my mother was not her favorite child, which made sense in that cultural context. My mother had two older brothers and a younger sister, so she was neither a son nor the baby of the family. As a result, my grandmother rarely spoke to her and often mistreated her. One day, my grandmother's best friend pulled my mother aside and revealed a secret that my grandmother had never admitted. My mother's father was not my grandmother's first husband, as she had claimed, but rather the son of Chiang Kai-shek, the former leader of the Republic of China who later became the president of Taiwan. My grandmother never confirmed this story and recently passed away, taking the secret with her. However, the claim is supported by other facts, including that Chiang Kai-shek was my mother's godfather, and there are photos and even a magazine cover of her as a baby sitting on his lap. Story 53. I visited my father in Mexico nearly 10 years after he was deported. This was my first time seeing him in a decade, and he introduced me to many relatives. Within just a couple of blocks, I must have met around 50 family members. My father had built a house there after being deported, and his next-door neighbor was his uncle. I never met this uncle because my father said he despised him, describing him as an unpleasant person. A couple of weeks later, I woke up to find my father in an unusually good mood. It turned out that his uncle had taken his own life in the bathroom. He had suffered from anal cancer, or a related condition that made going to the bathroom unbearably painful for years. On my way back to the United States, my paternal grandmother revealed to me that the uncle had abused my father when he was younger. Story 43. Not my story, but a close friend of mine. He plays the French horn. But he stopped for a few years. He told everyone he was too busy to play, but he recently told me and a few other friends the real reason. Apparently, his grandmother used to sit next to him while he practiced and would hit him every time he made a mistake. Eventually, he couldn't handle it anymore and stopped playing until after his grandmother passed away. Also, his mom is now in jail for physically hurting him and his older sister. The abusive behavior initially started by accident. One day, his mom was cooking dinner, had a knife in her hand, turned around too quickly, and accidentally cut his sister's hand. After that, she began hurting his sister intentionally, then started hitting her, and eventually moved on to hurting him as well. One day, his mom struck his sister so hard with a hanger that it tore through her shirt. My friend tried to protect his sister, but he was then kicked out of the house and went to live with his dad. Shortly after that, his mom was arrested. I have another friend who has been through even more. I met her less than a month ago, and so far she has shared the first part of her life story with me. My friend's dad was abusive, so when she was 8 months old, her mom left but couldn't take her along. Her mom was deported back to Europe and didn't return to America for several years. Her dad always told her that her mom left because she didn't want her. A few years later, her dad married her first stepmother, who had 2 older sons. My friend's dad had to leave to take care of her grandfather, who had cancer. Her stepmother didn't like her, and her stepbrothers would often get her in trouble just to see her punished by their mom. The older stepbrother also started physically hurting her, giving her black eyes and harassing her. Her stepmother would also humiliate her in front of the stepbrothers. Her dad never found out about the abuse, but he divorced the stepmother for other reasons. They moved, and he got a new girlfriend who seemed nice and had a son. Although the new girlfriend and her son were not abusive like the previous family, my friend shared a room with the son. He used to chase her around with a small torch as a prank and harassed her for many years. She still blames herself for everything that happened to her, even though none of it was her fault. Oh, and my brother is somewhat involved with drugs, and my grandpa might have harmed someone when he was drunk. Story 44. My grandfather on my dad's side passed away from a massive heart attack at the young age of 40 when my dad was about 10 or 12. Sometime after the funeral, my grandmother began a relationship with a man named Mitch, who my dad and his siblings strongly disliked. I'd always heard casual mentions of Mitch growing up, but when I got older, I asked my mom about him, since my dad rarely talks about his past. And she told me that Mitch was a gigolo who eventually married my grandmother. After a few years together, Mitch had drained her finances, leading them to file for bankruptcy multiple times, 3 times, nearly 4. Apparently, he was very abusive towards my dad and his siblings until my dad was around 17 or 18. At this point, and this is a story my great-aunt loves to recount after a few drinks, my dad chased Mitch through the house with a baseball bat, forcing him to hide under a bed. Ultimately, my grandmother got an annulment and somehow managed to revert to her former last name, allowing her to resume receiving military benefits from my late grandfather. Story 45. Paternal side. My grandpa was a Vietnam vet and lost in action for some weeks. Never found out what happened then exactly. He turned into a drunk and slept around when he came back, and my father or his brothers would often have to search the ditches near the local bar for their passed-out drunk dad. One night my grandpa woke up from a nightmare and realized he was choking my grandma. My dad had a bad relationship with his father because of stuff like this. But seeing as how a lot of his behavior was pretty obviously PTSD, I'm on neither side. Maternal side. My mom was an accident conceived out of wedlock, which ruined my grandparents' lives. This was the 50s. They were very poor and unhappy with each other. After a while, another baby was on the way, and seeing as how they barely had enough to feed my mom, Grandma went to get an illegal abortion. Grandma already had her skirt hitched up when she realized she couldn't follow through with it. I'm glad she didn't because my aunt is the sweetest, most genuine person I know. There's also a rumor that maternal grandpa's father performed abortions in the back room of a bar after the war. I don't believe it. I'd like to ask my grandpa about it, but my mom has sworn me to secrecy. Story 46. I went to an all-girls private school. Woo, kilts. There was one girl there who was quite needy. If you were kind to her, she would latch onto you and be nearly impossible to shake off. I got along with her well enough, but I kept my distance because of that. I did notice, even as a day student, that she never seemed eager to go home. She only went home when the school closed, and she had to, like during Christmas. She was sent to summer camp every year. I didn't think much of it, just found it a little odd. But there were other girls, like the foreign students, who never went home either. And she was from the US. This school was in Ontario. Boarding students would take buses to the local mall on weekends where they could shop, see movies, etc. before getting bussed back. One day, she was caught shoplifting during one of these trips and ended up being expelled. I always thought that was unfair, considering that if a day student like me got caught shoplifting over the weekend, we wouldn't have been expelled. At most, our mall privileges would have been revoked. Years passed, and I didn't think about her much, until one day when I was chatting with a friend's mom. She used to work at a local mental health facility, and while I'm sure it was a breach of confidentiality, she shared some details with me. The reason the girl rarely went home was that her family didn't want her. When she was very young, too young to be left in charge, her toddler brother had wandered onto the pool cover and drowned. The family blamed her for the accident and kept her at a distance whenever possible. She had seen a local psychologist to deal with guilt and abandonment issues, understandably, but she was surprisingly well adjusted. After she was expelled, her family took her back to the US and had her committed. It's shocking what some parents can do.